Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today, we are excited to bring to you Francine Hirsch as the Jackson Center's Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II. A quick note before we get started today. If you have a question during today's program, please put it in the Q&A at any time that you think of it. We will address the questions at the end after Francine has done her presentation and we've asked her some questions, but I don't want you to forget your question. So feel free to put it in the Q&A at any time. So with us today is Francine Hirsch, the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and an historian of modern Europe with a specialization in Russia and the Soviet Union. We will be discussing her latest book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II. You can see it right there. And this book offers the first complete picture of the role of the Soviet Union in the Nuremberg Trials and the often ignored contribution the Soviet Union made both to the trials and to the development of international humanitarian law. Francine, thank you so much for being with us today, especially today, on the 75th anniversary of General Rudenko's opening statement.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here. It's a great honor to be at the Jackson Center, even if it's only virtually. And one of the things that Robert H. Jackson is best known for is the important role that he played in the Nuremberg trials in the wake of World War II in occupied Germany. And it's really been fascinating for me to get to know Jackson, as it were, while doing my research. And I'm very grateful for the folks at the Jackson Center for sharing photos with me while I was doing my research, and also just for posting documentary footage of the trials on their website, which I really encourage everyone to have a look at. So the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, the first of the Nuremberg trials and the one that Jackson participated in, took place from November 1945 to October 1946. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the four major Allied powers, tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. And as noted, we're now marking Nuremberg's 75th anniversary year. And yes, this is the 75th anniversary today of Roman Rudenko's opening speech for the Soviet prosecution. I want to start today, though, by going back to the summer before the trials. From late June through early August 1945, representatives from the four powers, including Jackson, met in London to work out what we now know as the Nuremberg Charter, setting out the framework for the IMT, the whole legal framework. And I just want to say that Jackson had some concerns from the very start about four-power cooperation, and especially about working with the Soviets. And so I want to read, it's a short passage, just a couple of minutes from chapter 2 of my book, to just set the scene really for the rest of the talk. Okay, so here we go. Robert H. Jackson would have liked nothing more than to move forward without the Soviets, whom he was already regarding as the Achilles heel of the entire plan for a four-power tribunal. He was learning more by the day from the OSS and other intelligence sources about Soviet actions during the war. At a June 11th meeting with American religious leaders, Jackson had shared his anxiety about potential problems arising during the trials as a result of the Soviet Union's invasions of Poland and Finland in 1939. But the Soviet Union could not exactly be uninvited or excluded from participating in the prosecution of the former Nazi leaders. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had been first to propose an international tribunal, and the Soviet lawyer Aaron Trainin had provided key arguments about the Nazi conspiracy and about the illegality of aggressive war. But Jackson worried that the Soviets would undermine the tribunal's legitimacy just by participating, and he was beginning to ponder ways of minimizing their impact. It would be so much easier if they simply didn't show up. The Soviets had no intention of not showing up. In June 1945, Soviet leaders were still gaining a full realization of what their country had endured during the war. The Soviet Union's losses were almost beyond belief. some 27 million Soviet citizens had perished. That's 1 out of every 7 people, and 2/3 of the dead were civilians. The world did not seem to grasp the sheer magnitude of Soviet losses. An international tribunal would provide the Soviets with a public forum for a reckoning. It would expose Nazi crimes, and Soviet leaders believed would facilitate Moscow's claims for material compensation and German labor for reparations. The stakes for the Soviet Union were thus extremely high. I just saw something about audio being lost. So before I continue, I just want to make sure people can hear me.
You sound fine to me.
Okay, all right, I will keep going then. All right. So, well, of course, the Soviets did show up in London, and then they went on to play a critical role in Nuremberg itself. But in the United States, Nuremberg has been remembered chiefly as an American story. In the most popular accounts, Jackson is the hero of the moment. The TV docudrama Nuremberg, which maybe some of you have seen, is a really great example of this. Jackson, played by a young, square-jawed Alec Baldwin, is the driving force behind the entire trial. The British and the French play noble but supporting roles. And the Soviets, well, they come off as brutish and vengeful, and in some scenes, really is no better than the Nazi defendants. This version of the Nuremberg story has persisted for decades in different versions. And there are several reasons, I think, why the Soviet contribution to Nuremberg has gone pretty much underappreciated. This includes limited access to the former Soviet archives, especially during the Cold War. It also includes the fact that the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial and the judges trial, those were carried out by the United States alone. But there's also a deeper issue at play, I think, in how Nuremberg is remembered. And that has to do more with our discomfort with historical complexity. Because the Soviet role in the Nuremberg trials, it was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, such as the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish officers who were prisoners of war, to blame that on the Nazis. In a more general sense too, I think, the contribution of Stalin's Soviet Union to the IMT sort of upends the myth of Nuremberg as fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. Well, I argue in my book, and I'll argue here today, that I think we need the full story. The real Nuremberg story, the full Nuremberg story, it's messy. It's also incredibly interesting. And I also think it's necessary because Nuremberg, it still matters. For some, Nuremberg remains a kind of gold standard for international justice. For others, it's an appalling example of victor's justice that should never be repeated. And no matter what one's opinion is about this, right? If Nuremberg is to offer any kind of meaningful lessons, we really need to understand what actually happened. So my aim in my book is to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. And the book draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. These materials include transcripts of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It includes secret telegrams from Nuremberg to Moscow and back. It includes letters, diaries, surveillance reports that give us a sense of the day-to-day life of the members of the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg. We get their impressions of the city, the food, the nightlife, their impressions of the defendants. It includes lists of possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution and their depositions. And it also includes things like marked up copies of the indictment and the judgment and other documents that the Soviets secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval. We see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the trials, but we do also see the ways in which Soviet participation really did threaten to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. The book also aims to use the Soviet peace and the Soviet archives combined with other sources to tell a richer story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. Looking at the relationship among all 4 powers really opens things up. There were 4 prosecution teams at Nuremberg: American, British, Soviet, and French. There were 4 main judges, one representing each country of the prosecution. And while we tend to think of Nuremberg as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, It was also a contest among the countries of the prosecution for power, for influence, for control also over the narrative of the war. The relationship among the prosecutors and among the judges and between the prosecutors and the judges are highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice and compromises made on all sides. We see the importance of the nightlife and the parties with an endless flow of alcohol for keeping things congenial and sometimes for keeping the trials on track. And we also see how the Nuremberg courtroom became a front of the Cold War. So I wanted to say a little bit now about the narrative arc. The book starts during the darkest days of the war. It then covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter, which were held in London, and also the negotiations about the indictment, which set out the charges. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment, which to the dismay of the Soviets resulted in several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period. Now, my aim was to tell a good story and also to introduce readers to a new cast of characters. And we see Nuremberg and the trials through people like the Soviet documentary filmmaker Roman Carmen and the political cartoonist Boris Efimov and other Soviet correspondents. Some, like Carmen, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps, and they bring that experience then with them to the Nuremberg courtroom. We see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, who was the Soviet Union's deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions. Vyshinsky had earlier been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, which were a series of major show trials which Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Vyshinsky just spent 1 week actually in Nuremberg, his influence was constant for the Soviet delegation. We also see the Soviets, the Americans, the French, and the British getting to know each other. And here, Jackson's unpublished diaries, which are at the Library of Congress, are just a wonderful source, full of sharp observations. Jackson judged one dinner that he had hosted at Claridge's in London during that summer of 1945 to have been, I'm going to quote Jackson here, to have been very successful from the point of view of cultivating relations, even as he noted that the Soviets drank very little and were somewhat scornful of the yellow liquid claimed to be vodka, which was served. Okay, so the book makes a number of arguments, and for most of the rest of my time presenting today, I'm going to take you briefly through 4 of them. And then if people are interested, we can come back to any of them in the Q&A. So argument 1, without the Soviets, Nuremberg most likely never would have happened. Or if it had happened, if something had happened, it would have looked very, very different. The Soviets took up the question of Nazi criminality early in the war, prompted by the brutality of the Nazi occupation. In April 1942, Foreign Minister Molotov published his 3rd note on German atrocities, citing evidence that the burning of villages and the massacre of civilians were part of a deliberate Nazi plan. 6 months later, in October 1942, the Soviets were out in front, publicly calling for the convening of a special international tribunal and inviting all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. Now, the United States and Britain, they were slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. And the British argued that the crimes of the Nazi leaders were far too serious for a trial and pushed instead for punishment by executive decree. As the war continued, the Soviet lawyer Aron Chainin influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Chainin argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as what he called crimes against peace. He also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in a criminal conspiracy, and he challenged the defense of just following orders. Chainin set out his ideas in a book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, and one of the things I was able to do with my research was trace how this book made its way across Europe to London and then to Washington, D.C., where it landed at the War Department's Special Projects Branch and at the White House. Now, Chainin was not the only lawyer arguing for the criminality of aggressive war, But whereas many European and American lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets had no such reservations, and that would end up being very significant. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Trainin was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to London in that summer of 1945 to negotiate the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace was one of the 3 categories of crime set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Okay, so on to argument 2. So argument 2, the Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion and were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given. They were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. They aimed to use the IMT to demonstrate Nazi guilt and also to tell a story about Soviet heroism and Soviet suffering. They certainly did not expect the defendants to be allowed to take the stand in their own defense or to be allowed to call witnesses. Soviet expectations shaped their choice of personnel. Key members of the Soviet delegation, including Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko and Soviet Judge Yona Nikitchenko, had cut their teeth on the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. That's where they got their experience. And they had no experience with the finer points of a Western-style trial, including cross-examination. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script, just as the prosecution had done in the Moscow trials, and just as the prosecution had done in the Soviet Union's own war crime trials up until that point. They were so confident of this that they insisted on including the Katyn massacre in the indictment as a German war crime. And again, this was a crime that we now know decisively that the Soviets had committed. They believed that the defendants wouldn't be able to challenge the evidence. The Soviets were also so confident that the victors would control the script that they initially didn't bother to tell their chief prosecutor, Rudenko, about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact of 1939, in which Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide up Poland and the Baltic states. They assumed that Rudenko didn't need to know, even though Ribbentrop, the former German foreign minister, had signed the pact and was one of the defendants. Stalinism left the Soviet delegation unprepared in other ways too. The Soviets didn't have enough able interpreters and translators, partly because during the Stalinist terror, many German speakers had been arrested and shot. Also, Stalin's insistence on centralized control meant that the Soviet prosecutors and the Soviet judge had much less independence than their American, British, and French counterparts. Rudenko and Nikitchenko had to clear each and every decision with Soviet leaders back in Moscow. They smuggled documents back through secret channels to Andrei Vyshinsky's commission, and Andrei Vyshinsky's commission then sent them further up the chain of command to Molotov and sometimes even to Stalin. The paper trail that this produced is an amazing source for the historian. This was just really incredible to go to the archive and to see. The Moscow archives have things like marked up drafts of the indictment and marked up drafts of the judgment. And the judgment, of course, that wasn't supposed to circulate. They worked on the judgment in a locked room where they burned the trash every night, but Nikitchenko still managed to get a copy of it out. So great for the historian, but bad for the Soviet delegation. Because for the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg, sending these documents back and forth to Moscow through secret channels, often via Berlin, was an absolute nightmare. Documents were sometimes lost in transit. Instructions often arrived too late to be of real use. Nikitchenko and Rudenko were left scrambling. Okay. Argument 3. At Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust and what at the time was talked about as Hitler's final solution. Now, this Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were mostly Jews. In part because the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was launched after Nuremberg is part of what remains in people's minds as well. But at Nuremberg, the Soviet presentations on crimes against humanity included extensive evidence of the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. Evidence included things like a report from the commanders of Einsatzgruppe A, Death Squad A, bragging, and I'm going to quote here, bragging about having fulfilled orders to eliminate the Jews to the fullest possible extent in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It also included things like a Polish government report stating that, again, I'll quote again, 3 million Jews have been exterminated in Poland. The Soviets also sent 10 eyewitnesses to Nuremberg, and 2 of them, Samuel Rajman and the Yiddish poet Avraham Sutzkever, were sent specifically to testify about Nazi crimes against the Jews. The Soviet prosecution called Sutzkever to the witness box in late February 1946, and his testimony was absolutely harrowing. He spoke about the Einsatzgruppen and the systematic killing of the Jews in Vilna, and he also recounted the murder of his newborn son by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital. Sutzkever remained standing in the witness box, the only witness to do so, as if he later wrote in his diary, he was saying Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. He also wrote that he had considered it a matter of Jewish destiny, that he, a Yiddish poet, had survived to Judge Rosenberg and Frank in Nuremberg, and through them, all who had adhered to their ideology. Okay, argument 4. The Nuremberg Trials became an early front of the Cold War, and understanding Nuremberg as such gives us a very important perspective on the post-war movement for human rights. Now, the prosecution presented its case from November 1945 through February 1946. It was the Americans went, and then the British, and then the French, and then the Soviets went last. And through that time, tensions among the 4 powers were mostly kept under wraps. Then in March of 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March 5th, the former British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, gave what we now talk about as his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. The very next day, the defense case began. When the Soviets got to the courtroom in the morning, there were copies of the US Army newspaper Stars and Stripes scattered everywhere with a big headline, "Unite to Stop the Russians." In fact, the defense attorneys were holding up copies of the newspaper for their clients to be able to read over their shoulders. All of this energized the defense, who upped their effort to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war against the Soviet Union and not a war of aggression. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact. And he argued that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviets certainly were too. One Soviet informant, writing home after Ribbentrop's testimony, expressed alarm that the Soviet Union, and I'll quote a bit from his telegram home, he said, the Soviet Union, a country of victors, had gone to Nuremberg to prosecute the fascists and had instead become the object of their provocative attacks. The challenges to the Soviet Union kept coming. Goering's attorney petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges that German forces had carried out the Katyn massacre, and the Western judges, outvoting Nikitchenko 3-1, allowed these witnesses. The witnesses ultimately cast enough doubt on the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hour socializing, including tennis matches and pool parties as the weather grew warmer, prevented things in Nuremberg from completely falling apart. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions by the judges that went against Soviet interests after that point, and there were many 3-1 decisions against Nikitchenko as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. As a result of Nuremberg, the Cold War and the post-war movement for human rights became completely entangled. This in turn shaped and also hampered subsequent deliberations in the United Nations about turning what was soon known as the Nuremberg Principles, including the ideas of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, into permanent international law and creating an international criminal court. So I want to end by just reflecting a bit on Nuremberg's legacy. To be totally honest, I worry sometimes that I'm telling a story about the Nuremberg trials that maybe people don't want to hear. The Hollywood version of the Nuremberg story, after all, is very uplifting, right? And Russia has its own version of the Nuremberg story, simplified in its own way, that does not include Katyn or dwell on the details of the secret protocols. But I do think that the more expansive Nuremberg story offers important lessons about the possibilities as well as the perils of international cooperation. The IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism. It actually involved endless negotiations and very difficult compromises by representatives of four governments with very different ideas about justice. At Nuremberg, representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union worked hard to find common ground, even as Cold War tensions flared. And in important ways, they succeeded. They created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich and pushed forward the work of denazification. They set the precedent that launching a war of aggression was a criminally punishable act. And they sparked an international conversation about crimes against humanity, genocide, and the protection of human rights. An important conversation, and one that thankfully continues to this day. I want to close by saying that by the time I had finished writing my book, I was just filled with great admiration for Jackson and how he navigated a politically treacherous situation. In the Hollywood version of the Nuremberg story, Jackson has it pretty easy, right? He's the one who's calling the shots. But Jackson didn't have it easy at all. He faced all kinds of challenges and all kinds of constraints. And he was clear-eyed all the way through about the perils of four-power cooperation. But he also recognized the symbolic importance and the importance for the future of a four-power trial. And he worked hard to keep things on course. Jackson was both conflicted and determined. And really, that's the version of Jackson that I'd really love to see in a movie. So I'll just end there, and thank you all for your attention.
Francine, thank you very much. I would also now like to welcome Greg Peterson, a partner with Phillip's Lytle and one of the co-founders of the Jackson Center, who will be assisting me with questions today. So Greg, I will turn it over to you to start.
Francine, I really enjoyed the book, the first read through about 4 months ago, and it gets better the second read, having done it this past week. The detail that you had, and frankly, the new research you did. And frankly, I'm interested, because that's a lot of what we do at the Jackson Center, is do the research to peel back the onion. Here you were in 2005, professor of history, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and you decide you're going to go into the archives. Was there much pushback? It's like, who are you?
Well, that's kind of what we do as historians of the Soviet Union, is like do that research in the Russian archives. And so some of the archives I had been to before when I was working on my first book. And the whole process of archival research was incredibly interesting. I started the research in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. GARF is what we call it by the acronym. And because that's where the transcript of the Nuremberg trials is located. And it was also where I actually just started to find some really interesting, like, unofficial materials, like some of those the surveillance reports that I mentioned. One of the most interesting things I found was a surveillance report by a Soviet editor, like an editor journalist, who wrote back like this 6-page report talking about the difficult situation and how they don't have enough translators and how the women don't have enough good clothing and they're getting made fun of by the British and the Americans, stuff like that. And that's why I was like, wow, this is actually really, really interesting. The hardest archive to get access to was the Foreign Ministry archive. And so that was the one that I had to be very patient and very persistent to be allowed to be able to work in. And eventually, towards the very end of my stay, I was notified that I could work there. And at that point, I think I only had 3 days in Moscow left. So of course, I called the airlines, and I postponed to stay in Russia a bit longer to be able to have more time to get in there. And that was just really incredibly interesting, because that's where there are the secret files from Andrei Vyshinsky and Vyacheslav Molotov, and where I was able to, again, see those documents, like the marked up copies of the judgment and the indictment. But that archive is really interesting too, because there's an archive guide, but they keep it locked under glass, like on a glass case. And it's only like after a while that they would allow me to see the guide. So the thing about archival research, and just one of the way I'm like incredibly grateful to kind archivists, because for anyone, you can't do this kind of research at all unless, the archivists are the ones who know the files. They're the ones who are able to help you out. And I had a very good experience in Moscow. I was lucky that way. And the timing was good too. I think it would be really different going back right now, like at this political moment. But in 2005 and 2006, when I did that research, it was more possible.
It's my understanding that the Soviet government had an extraordinary state commission, which conducted a lot of investigations and a lot of reports, which I suspect the Russians felt that presenting those reports at the Nuremberg trial would be final.
Yes, exactly. So they did indeed. So back during when the Soviets were initially calling for a tribunal, even before the Western powers were interested, it was right around that time during the war that they set up this Extraordinary State Commission. That was actually a really long name that goes on for like a block, but we'll call it the Extraordinary State Commission. And they were indeed doing their own research and investigating war crimes. And there's a scholar in Russia, Marina Sorokina, who's done very, very good work on this Extraordinary State Commission. But they did think, because one of the rules in the charter, actually, so the charter that was negotiated in London, there was this article in the charter, Article 21, like whoever thought like these articles in a charter could be so interesting, but they are, because Article 21 stated that any evidence from an official National War Crimes Commission would be accepted as incontrovertible evidence. Now, the thing is, like, what does incontrovertible mean? What it meant what they decided it meant after a lot of back and forth once the trials were already in process, was that the Soviets could just present it. But the Soviets took that to mean that the defendants could not challenge it. And they get very upset about this, what they consider to be this misreading of Article 21. And so this becomes a really big episode behind the scenes in the trial, because their understanding of Article 21 is part of why, indeed, they thought that they'd be able to just submit their evidence, including Extraordinary State Commission reports, but also these reports on Katyn, which were put together by another commission called the Burdenko Commission, and were very surprised when they found that the defendants would be able to challenge them in court.
So talk about the Katyn. I'm glad you brought that up. During the opening statement, which was General Rudenko 75 years ago to the day, and then several other Soviet prosecutors sort of picked up pieces of that, and shortly thereafter, I think his name's Pokrovsky, excuse me, brought up Katyn. I mean, he just presented that as part of the opening statement that would be proved. Now, was there a sense from the other prosecutions that there was kind of like, oh man, did they really want to bring this up?
Oh, absolutely. So Katyn is very, very interesting. So it was during the war when the territory was under Nazi control, because Katyn is outside of Smolensk. And so it's at the time that the Germans announced that they've discovered these mass graves. And so they blame it on the Soviets blame it on the Germans. It becomes a real political hot potato. And at the end of the trial, at the end of the war rather, the Soviets think, okay, like this is like the war is over now, we'll blame it fully on the Nazis. And they initially think that they talk about having their own Katyn commission and their own Katyn trial, rather, I should say. But then, I don't know, someone in the secret security services got the idea of just adding it to the Nuremberg trials, right? Why not? But it's in these deliberations, again, like whoever thought deliberations about an indictment would be so interesting, but the deliberations about the indictment are fascinating because you have representatives from all four powers, and the Soviets in the indictment, they added in, the Katyn massacre. And then the Western powers are, including Jackson, including British Deputy Chief Prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, including French, right? They say, well, wait a second, like whether they don't blame the Soviets, they know this is a political hot potato, and they say there might not be like really definitive evidence that could be presented. Are you sure you want to do this? That just to bring it up at all kind of opens the door to this, and maybe we don't even want this to be part of the trials. And Rudenko says at this point, I have no choice. Like this has to be in there. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go back to Moscow and talk to Stalin about this personally, and this is going to take a while. And so at that point, they allow it to go in there. But we know from Jackson's correspondence, we know from there are some other documents from David Maxwell Fyfe's correspondence as well. We know that they were very concerned about this. And then the indictment gets published. I don't remember the date. It's something like October 18th. And then it's like 2 days later, Jackson gets word from intelligence that they have more evidence really suggesting that the Soviets were guilty. And at that point, the indictment is already published. I feel for Jackson so much in that situation. I think that at that point, you sense his frustration with this whole thing, like just growing. And I think like what it must have taken at that point to decide that the ends, right, of this trial were like worth going through and seeing through. But I think it haunts the whole trial from that point on.
Well, as it became the genie out of the bottle when that is presented by the Russians, that now the Germans, as part of their defense case, decide that they better deal with this.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And Lawrence, right after the last personal defendant's case, Fritsch's, set aside time to actually deal with the question.
I know. Yeah. So Pokrovsky, you're right. That is as part of the Soviet presentations in February. So Pokrovsky was Yuri Pokrovsky was deputy chief prosecutor, and he was the one who they gave the job of presenting the evidence on Katyn. And this evidence is fabricated, right? And so the defense then petitions for witnesses, and Rudenko, they're all surprised when the judges say yes. Now they allow 3 defense witnesses. They also allow 3 Soviet witnesses. And of course, you're absolutely right. This takes place in July, kind of after everything else. It's kind of the last thing. And it's a big showdown of the witnesses. And in the end, like all the newspaper reports say, oh, it was inconclusive. But inconclusive is a Soviet loss at that point because the Soviets were the one who had put that charge forward. So.
All right, I showed this off camera earlier, but I'm going to show you this autograph that I obtained of Wyszynski. And because of the autograph, I enjoyed so immensely your book about learning more about him. And in fact, he has as much in your book as Jackson references. So Robert Jackson and Wyszynski have the same number of pages. Can you tell me a little bit more about him? Because he seemed to be the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, Wyszynski was the man behind the curtain. He's such an interesting figure. So, and such a like troubling one, right? I mean, you don't want to like over the interesting part, but Andrei Wyszynski, he had an experience as a lawyer, actually. So one of the really interesting things, if I talk about in the beginning of the book, if people are interested, is that so Andrei Wyszynski had originally been involved at this Institute of Law where Aaron Trainin had been as well. And so they knew each other early on. And that's part of the reason that Aaron Trainin gets involved in this, right? But Wyszynski had also been the chief prosecutor in the 3 Moscow trials of 1936, 37, and 38. And again, these are show trials, like the way that we think about show trials, where people like Leon Trotsky, who was, right, people like Nikolai Bukharin, people like, Trotsky's not there, but they're all charged of being Trotskyists, but Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, they're all kind of brought in before this tribunal, members of the Communist International. And this is one of those cases where it's clear they're all going to be declared guilty, like right from the start. So they're big show trials, and Wyszynski does wonderfully in this. Stalin's very pleased. He had actually been involved in earlier show trials in the Soviet Union beforehand too. So again, the fact that so Wyszynski, rises up. He's also then deputy foreign minister, but then the fact that Stalin picks him, right, to head this secret commission that's based in Moscow and that's supposed to oversee the trials is very significant in terms of thinking about like what Stalin and Molotov thought these trials were going to be like. And in terms of thinking about the degree of control that they thought that the Soviets and Wyszynski were going to be able to exert over the delegation. One of the interesting moments for me in the book and in the research, where there's 1 week in November when Wyszynski goes to Nuremberg, because this is the thing, he's supposed to be managing this from afar. But they find out, so early on, the trials have started, and the Soviets learn that one of the defense attorneys, Alfred Seidel, that he goes to the tribunal and he asks to be able to introduce the secret protocols. And at that point, is like Rudenko doesn't have information about the secret protocols. This is going to be a big mess. And so that's when Wyszynski shows up in Nuremberg. He shows up as a guest, an esteemed guest, deputy foreign minister. We have photos of him in the courtroom, just kind of like sitting and staring. And you get from memoirs, and you get from some of this material, just like how everyone got, just like the energy shifts, right? The energy shifts among the members of the Soviet delegation when he's around, the energy shifts in general. Like Telfer Taylor, he writes in his memoir about the trial, in fact, how this, like everyone just didn't know like what to expect from him. Like, why was Wyszynski there? Like, what was happening? But what's happening behind the scenes is Wyszynski every day practically is holding a meeting, right, with the members of the Soviet delegation and telling them what they should do, filling them in on certain information that they didn't have before, and selectively, right? That's the other thing. Not all the members of the Soviet delegation get in on all the information, but some of them get more information than they had before. And there's this great moment, one of those great horrible moments, right, where there's a dinner party that is held, I think the British hold it, and it's at that moment where Wyszynski, he proposes a toast. And the Soviets, you have to know, they have terrible problems with translation, terrible problems with interpretation. And this is one of those moments where Wyszynski gives a toast, and the toast gets translated after they've drunk to it. And by the time they've drunk to it, all the Western judges realize that they've just drunk to the deaths of the defendants. And they're horrified, right? That something like made the defendants go from the courthouse to the graves. And so yeah, people talk about that moment as well. Yeah, he's a very, interesting is not really the right word, but that's the word that comes to mind when talking about Wyszynski.
Complicated, like all.
Complicated, yes.
Well, what I found interesting is when you talk about these work sessions, Moscow would be giving Wyszynski the information, and then all of a sudden, let me get rid of this here. There, I'm back up. He would meet with Nikitchenko and Rudenko. I mean, here's the judge and the prosecutor in the same room, the room where it happens, and that's so unusual in our, world of thinking that would happen, but there it did.
No. This is one of the things that Rudenko, I mean, there's all kinds of talk about like whether Nikitchenko and Rudenko are working together. And of course they're working together, right? That's just the assumption. Yeah, so that's absolutely. And Wyszynski is calling the shots as much as he can, right? But there's difficulty getting that information conveyed. And then Nikitchenko and Rudenko have lots of difficulty actually doing what they're told to do, right? Because there they are in a room negotiating with representatives of the other powers, and they're just supposed to solve these issues on the spot, right? There isn't an expectation that everyone's going to go back and secretly send information back to their governments and wait 2 days. And then the Soviets are also having problems translating those materials that they're sending back. So it just becomes very, very complicated for them.
One person you spent some time in the book, and it was fascinating, being in the audiovisual world that we are at the Jackson Center, is Roman Carmen, and his role there, gathering of evidence, and ultimately his movie, Judgment of the Peoples. Could you talk a little bit about Roman?
Yeah, so no, Roman Carmen was is a super interesting figure. When I started working on this project before I ended up working on Nuremberg, I thought initially, oh, I just want to work on Roman Carmen because his archive is his materials are in the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art. And that was really a joy to work in that archive and to be able to see kind of his private reflections on what was happening in the Nuremberg trials. Carmen, he was a very well-known, very famous in Russia at the time, documentary filmmaker. He had done all kinds of films of the Soviet national republics, and he goes on and has quite a career as well. And so again, the fact that the Soviets sent him to Nuremberg is very significant. They send him in order to make a documentary film of the trials. And so he's filming the trials while he's there. But he and his group is back in Moscow. They're also putting together documentary like film footage as evidence for the trials as well, of evidence that he and other Soviet filmmakers had shot during the war, like during the liberation of concentration camps, that they had shot of destroyed cities and destroyed villages. And so that goes into these 3 very important films that the Soviets show during the trial. So he has a very significant role in terms of the putting together of Soviet evidence, in terms of that Soviet film that gets shown after the trial. And for me in the book, part of what I tried to do is really see Nuremberg through the eyes of the Soviet participants, because that's a different kind of perspective that I think we haven't really had before on the Nuremberg trials. And so I actually start the book with Roman Carmen coming into Nuremberg. And what Roman Carmen writes about in his own notes on the trials is when he's coming into the city for the first time, the last thing that what he remembers of that city are the newsreels that he's seen of all the Nazi rallies, right? And of all just that film footage of the Nazis in their glory days. And so much of his early reflections on what he's seeing in that moment are really about just how Nuremberg, like what it looks like now, what the defendants look like now. And so, yeah, for me, that was incredibly interesting. There's also lots of interesting material in memoirs and letters about his interaction with the other members of the Soviet delegation. Roman Carmen was apparently like quite a partier. So one of the other members of the delegation who had roomed with him at one point like switched rooms because it was just too much for him. So again, those kind of elements of we don't really think about, right? I also have these photos of Carmen like going about the city and at a soccer game in Nuremberg. Again, we don't think about that when we think of the Nuremberg trials, but again, like what it would have been like for these people from Stalin's Soviet Union to now be in Germany at that moment.
Before I wrap up and turn it back to Kristen, maybe just 2 points. One is if you could speak to the dissent, and at the end of the judgment at Nuremberg, the Soviet judges presented a dissent, and with regard to the German High Command and High Staff, and also the three acquittals. Could you speak to kind of the internal politics of that?
Right. So the Soviets have sent back, Nikitchenko has smuggled out a draft copy of the judgment and the verdicts to Moscow. And then he gets back, like, I don't remember if it's 12 pages, 16 pages, but long, like a very long telegram filled with these kind of marching orders, basically telling him to insist on guilty verdicts down the line, to insist on hangings down the line, but then telling him that if you have to negotiate, here's where you can negotiate on, like you can agree to a 20-year sentence for this person. Anyway, by the time Nikitchenko gets this, it's done. Like the judgment has been fully done and the verdicts have been fully done. Not that he'd have been able to change the other judges' minds at that point either. But back in Moscow, they're very unhappy about the fact that there will be 3 acquittals, Schacht, Fritzsche, and von Papen. So there's 3 acquittals, and that also that 3 of the organizations are found to be well, they're declared to not be, the question on that was whether they were criminal organizations or not. And for 3 of them, they're not found to be criminal organizations, although it's agreed that their individual members can be tried. And that's the German government and the SA, and then the question of the high commands as well. And so so back in Moscow, it's decided that there will be a dissent. And so there's 2 sets of interesting conversations, right? There's a conversation that Nikitchenko is having with Lawrence and the other judges, where he's signaling to them, because they've told the press already that it's going to be unanimous, and Nikitchenko's saying it's not going to be unanimous, right? And so so there's those internal politics. And then back in Moscow, as they're working on the dissent, of course, Nikitchenko does not write the dissent, right? The Soviets are not, in Nuremberg, are not writing a lot of the material that they're presenting. A lot of this is being written for them. And so it does, in fact, go around. So there's the Wyszynski Commission, and then another Politburo Commission. The Politburo is a high level of the party. So this goes through, and then the dissent goes through, and then Nikitchenko presents it, and it gets attached to the judgment. And I think in the end, everyone is happy enough with how it's gone, right? The Soviets, again, everyone, it stayed congenial, it stayed just fine. And I think it's really interesting too, at the end of the Nuremberg trials, in some of the discussions that happen afterwards about human rights and the lessons of Nuremberg and the Nuremberg principles, when you read some of the memoirs and other accounts by people like the US Judge Francis Biddle, who's arguing in favor of the Nuremberg principles, Biddle says, like, in the end, we all really mostly agreed, and that we were really on the same page, and it was just a few small things. And so, but yeah, the politics of that were really interesting to look at. And they're waiting, by the way, like they're waiting for that, for when they're always like waiting for, like, when is it going to come? And so they're waiting, like, is this dissent going to come in time for them or not too?
Wow. Before I turn over to Kristen, one final note. 75 years ago today, Rudenko gives the opening statement, as we said at the outset. And for those interested, it's on the Jackson Center YouTube site. If you've got good Russian in front of you or the transcript, you can listen to the entire opening statement. But Rudenko concludes, in sacred memory of millions of innocent victims of the fascist terror, for the sake of the consolidation of peace throughout the world, for the sake of the future security of nations, we are presenting the defendants with a just and complete account which must be settled. This is an account on behalf of all mankind, an account backed by the will and the conscience of all freedom-loving nations. May justice be done. Has justice been done?
Oh my gosh, people ask me that question. We're like, like deer in the headlights. I think that's such a complicated question. I think it was. I think the Americans felt that justice had been done, that in the sense that it was a fair trial that followed the rule of law as close as it could, that in the end, some of the questionable things like Katyn, like, were not part of the judgment, right? So they could feel okay about that. I think that for the Soviets did not feel that justice had been fully done, that for any of the defendants to have been acquitted, right? But this bigger question of, Holocaust Remembrance Day was just a week ago, and how can justice ever be done? That's really what I keep coming back to on that. How can justice ever be done? I think that, like, we as humans now, just you do the best you can. I think that Jackson and the others were committed to justice being done, and they did the best they could. And I think that the Nuremberg trials were important. They were important, and they did important things, right? And I fully believe that. But justice it's I think only people who have suffered, right, at the hands of something like that can decide that for themselves. I think it's just too personal. So that's how's that for dodging your question? But that's really how I feel about it. Yeah.
Well, that's spectacular. I know there's some questions that Kristen has, but I personally want to say thank you for this body of work. It has added significantly to a storyline which most of us were not aware. And kudos, and may there be more in your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was such a joy to talk with you.
Thank you. Kristen?
Yes, Francine. So we do have a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to start with, first off, sort of a basic question. Do you speak Russian? And so was that part of what aided you with your work?
Yes, I do. Yes, so that was, so it's been a little while since I've been in Russia now, but hopefully it'll all come back again. But yeah, no, you have to be able to read and speak to negotiate those archives well, I think.
Well, and so we do have some questions, even just sort of on the archives itself. So how confident were you, and this is from George, how confident were you that the Soviet archives provided to you were not doctored in some way in advance?
That's people have asked me that. And so I guess it's a kind of like what kind, I think the question with the Soviet archives is always like, what are you being allowed to see and what aren't you being allowed to see? And the way that the Soviet archives are organized, there are these different levels of secrecy. So just to give an example, like in GARF in the State Archive, there are things like the transcripts and some like basic information that you can see in the main reading room, but then you have to get permission to work in the special section of the archive to look at some other materials that have to do with like the state bureaucracy and law, that some of the more interesting things that had to do with Rudenko and the Secret Commission. And what I can say is that those files have now been shut down. So scholars can't look at them anymore. So which makes me feel even more confident that that was kind of the real deal, right? The same thing when you're looking in the Foreign Ministry Archive, very hard to get access to work in there. The documents themselves are, they're old, they're old documents, right? It's more a question of like, what couldn't I see? Like, I always wonder, like, were there secret conversations that Stalin had that there's a transcript of somewhere? Like, are there, so it's always, you work with the information that you have. The other thing with working with archival documents is you're not necessarily looking for it's not all about truth as much as it's about perspective, right? That you're getting, when these informants are in Nuremberg and writing reports home about how other people, members of the Soviet delegation, are shopping on the black market and they shouldn't be, or how they're getting into bar fights and they shouldn't be, right? Stuff like that. Did those bar fights really happen? Was there really shopping on the black market? Probably, but the fact also is that these are people who are expected to inform on other people, and so they're selectively gathering the kinds of information that they're reporting home on. So I think like what we do as historians is we do the best we can of reading lots of different documents against each other to try to put together as full a picture of we can. And when you're studying something like this with a four-power tribunal, I also worked in American archives, and I also looked at some British and French papers. And so you're just, again, trying to put together as rich a picture as you can. Now, that said, the Soviets, of course, did doctor documents about Katyn, right? And we know that. And those were not materials that I was able to see. For those materials, I relied on Russian and Polish scholars who had access to those materials and had published copies of some of those materials and analyses of those materials. So we're always learning, and we're always trying to put together as rich a picture as we can. And we're also always engaging with other scholars to try to double check and triple check what we think was the case. So it was kind of a long answer, but it's such a great question. It's a really important question about what you do with archival materials.
All right, and then one more process question that sort of leads us into some of the substantive questions. So a question from Oliver is, do you know if legal scholars were aware before your research of the presence of those draft judgments in the Russian archives?
That I'm actually not sure of that. I was working on, I know that there's another German scholar who was working on this material at the same time as I've been, and that there was a Russian, a wonderful Russian scholar, Natalia Lebedeva, who also was working on this, and that I believe that they also had seen those materials, but that's not anything that was talked about in the English language literature at all. So yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So we have a question from Jonathan, who's in London. He's currently writing a series for the BBC on the IMT. And so his questions, he's got a couple. How surprised do you think the Russians were at the London conference that the others didn't want a show trial structure?
So they were surprised all the way along, but it's more, even at the London conference, they didn't fully understand how things were shaping up. So this is the thing. So the London conference, you have to realize the Soviets have very poor interpreters there, actually. And they're also, so they're dealing with interpretation problems. They're also dealing with translation problems. They're sending materials just even about the charter back and forth to Moscow, and things are getting mistranslated sometimes. So again, like something like Article 21, what's incontrovertible evidence, right? That's not fully clear to them until the trials are already on. The question of what kind of defense will the Nazi defendants be able to put on, that wasn't clearly apparent to them until it was happening. Like they were shocked. It was only after Goering was giving testimony in the witness box, and he was allowed to go on for 2 weeks, that they fully got the picture of this is not going to be what we think it's going to be, right? There were a lot of things, like once things started, that surprised them. They also didn't, by the way, think that the Americans, they thought it was going to be quick, right? That the Americans were going to just, present their evidence. I'll say too that the Soviet and French legal system is different from the American and British legal systems. And in the Soviet system, all of the evidence is included in the indictment. And the indictment that was produced for Nuremberg was a compromise. It did include a lot more evidence than you'd ever normally get for an American or a British trial. But the Americans and the British kind of left it open that if they got more important evidence, they would be allowed to present it at the trial. And they did so for like months. And so they were surprised by that too. So they were constantly surprised. And a lot of that surprise came in process as things were actually happening.
Got it. Okay. So Alan had asked a question on, and so given what we were just talking about with some of the mistranslations and miscommunications, what were the contributions of the Soviet delegation to the drafting of the charter? He also notes that he believes Jackson reported favorably, that he was impressed with their learning and skill, but it sounds like there might still have been some challenges.
So in terms of the charter, this again, the Soviet idea, Chinese idea of crimes against peace became very significant in the framing of the charter itself. Their charter was really a four-way negotiation, right, on many of these issues. And so I would say in terms of when we think about the crimes against humanity charge, that was the French had a very significant role in shaping that charge. The Soviets had a very significant role in shaping the crimes against peace charge. That it was really four ways. In terms of the definition of conspiracy, that was something that the Soviets brought to the table as well. So yeah, that there's misunderstandings about the language, about what certain things mean. There were fights that they lost. The Soviets wanted the charter to include provisions absolutely banning propaganda during the trial, like banning the Nazis from using any propaganda or banning propagandistic statements. And they lost that battle because Jackson said, well, they're not going to do that, and the judges will be able to shut them down. And why would we, right? But of course that does end up happening. So no, there's so if I was to think about it longer, I'd come up with a lot more examples. There are a lot of interesting moments there. And the London Charter, by the way, so some of those, all of the deliberations about the London Charter, they're online. You can go to the Yale University website, to the Avalon Project, and you can read through, and you'll see the back and forth and the give and take, and how things changed and shifted along the way. It's incredibly interesting.
Yep. We did a program here with Professor Barrett as well on the London Charter and Agreement too.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yes. Did the four powers agree on clear criteria for imposing the death penalty?
So no, I mean, just in the sense that the Soviets believe that it should be like death penalty down the line. And that's something that I kind of had to stop for a second and think in terms of like clear criteria. I'm not even sure if they, in the end, came to clear criteria as much as they worked really hard to reach a consensus about each defendant. And there were long discussions about each defendant, but it wasn't that they had like a list of criteria to check off for it, which is interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. But yeah, that's.
And that question was from Michael. I forgot to mention that. So Gregory also there were a few people who had some follow-up questions on the commissions that you mentioned and the draft judgments. And you mentioned that there was a lot of sort of back and forth and these draft judgments came in. And I think one of the questions from Gregory is, does that mean that the Soviet judges may not have been as independent as the other judges?
Yes, it absolutely, they weren't all along, they were not as independent. No members of the Soviet delegation were. So that's, and that it also, what that meant is, I mean, you think like, oh, that means the Soviets are controlling things, but that's not how it worked. What it meant in practice, that ended up getting in their way, that they didn't have the same kind of flexibility as the other delegations, and they were sort of left at a loss because they also weren't used to making those kinds of decisions on their own. You see that even really early on at some of the early meetings where the Soviets aren't really sure like how to set a meeting agenda, like how to go about doing the things that we somehow take for granted at these international meetings.
Got it. Okay. David Lubin asked a question. So in Bradley Smith's 77 book about the Nuremberg trials, it says that the Soviets did not understand the conspiracy concept and were surprised by it, but it sounded like that's not true anymore, perhaps as research has evolved. Your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I would say that's not true, but it's really complicated. It actually took me, that was one of the parts of the book in terms of thinking about the organization's case and conspiracy and how that all worked. It took me a long time to get my mind around all that and to figure it out. So there are a few pieces, and I can go on for a long time, so just stop me at a certain point. But there are a couple of things. Like, first of all, when it came to the actual charges, right, in the indictment. Initially, it was thought that the charges would be the same charges that were laid out in Article 6 of the Charter, right? So the same categories, right? Crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It's actually at Jackson's initiative that the conspiracy charge gets added to the indictment. And I talk about this in the book, and my sense of this is that he does this in large part as a way of trying to have greater control over the case. That we know that Jackson did not trust the Soviets. He also did not trust the French. So he goes on a lot about that, even in some of his letters to Truman. And so the idea is if the Americans go first, and they present on conspiracy. And the way that Jackson initially thought about the conspiracy, it would be conspiring to commit crimes against peace, but also conspiring to commit war crimes, conspiring. So he used that as a way to say that the Americans could present evidence on every single charge. And so that's part of what Jackson does. So in terms of the Soviets not understanding it, they didn't understand what Jackson was trying to do with it. Like, that's for sure. They didn't understand, and they complained a lot that, like, what do you mean? Like, what's going on here? Because Jackson was then, again, this in their opinion, when the Wyszynski Commission meets, they're complaining all the time about Jackson hoarding evidence and taking evidence that they think should be going to them to present, or should be going to the French, the way that it was supposed to be. So the Americans would present on conspiracy, the British would present on crimes against peace. The Soviets would present on war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Eastern Front, and the French would present on war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Western Front. And so since the Americans went first, the Americans ended up presenting lots of evidence about war crimes and crimes against humanity, like everywhere, and the Soviets and the French are kind of up in arms about that. And Jackson does this under the conspiracy heading. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but by the end of the trials, in terms of the judgment, this becomes a really big issue because the judges have, and this is interesting too, it's not just the four countries against each other. The judges say that the prosecution didn't present enough evidence that there had been a conspiracy on anything except the planning and waging of war. And so they disentangle the conspiracy charge from war crimes and from crimes against peace, which ends up with some softer judgments in some cases than you would have gotten otherwise. So it's, but yeah, I do talk about that a lot in the book because again, I had to really wrap my mind around the legal concepts and also the politics involved.
So we have the first chief prosecutor from the International Criminal Court with us, Luis Moreno Ocampo, and he has a question about, was there something was there a relationship between the Tsar's support for international law and Stalin's support of international law? Are there any ties there, or any significant differences that you've noticed?
Oh, I love that question. So there are a number of scholars now doing really interesting work on Soviet and imperial international law, people like Peter Holquist, for example, and there absolutely are continuities. And one of the things that was really interesting for me, so I talked about Rudenko and Nikitchenko came more from this show trial tradition, but people like Aaron Chainin did not. Aaron Chainin had more of a classic legal education that would have been much more the case in Imperial Russia. And he started his education in Imperial Russia. And so that is a really important continuity. And that is part of why someone like Aaron Chainin spoke many languages. He had studied in Germany several times, including in the 1920s. He was familiar with Western law and international law. And so the Soviets, people of like Chainin and his generation, they were very plugged into international law more generally, in part because of the imperial government had been involved in that way and had much more of that classical education. So yes, I would say there's a continuity that way. In terms of whether Stalin wasn't interested in international law, I would say no, that Stalin was purely pragmatic about how he wanted to use the Nuremberg trials. But the reason that Chainin is tapped for this, right, that has to do with that continuity. And yeah, and that is something I talk about in the book as well, how the Soviets, they break with certain international law traditions early on for all kinds of reasons. They're not interested in the League of Nations and whatnot. They're not recognized by a bunch of other states. That's the case too. But then with the rise of Nazi Germany, that starts to shift. And people like Chainin, who had not been as active, and members of his generation, they become more active at that point.
We have several questions on Katyn that you and Greg sort of addressed as you were going through, but there's one that whether you think Rudenko was aware that Katyn was a Soviet crime, or was it just he wasn't fully informed, as you mentioned. Not everybody had all of the information at the time that they needed it. So what are your thoughts on Rudenko's knowledge at that point?
That is another fascinating question. That is another thing that I spent a lot of time in the book trying to figure out who exactly knew what when. So the Soviets had a Katyn subcommission, and Chainin was actually a member of that subcommission, and so was another member of another Soviet assistant prosecutor. I think it was Lev Shainin, I'm not remembering now. And so certain members of the Soviet delegation did know. I don't know if Rudenko knew. Right. I actually don't know if Rudenko knew. Azoria, another Soviet assistant prosecutor, did know. One of the reasons he was sent to Nuremberg was to deal with the charges around Katyn and the secret protocols, and he ends up dead. So that's another kind of episode there where, that he ends up with a bullet in the head, and there's question about whether it was suicide or murder or what was involved. And so but either way, clearly, this was an issue that Moscow was worried about. But it's interesting, there's a really wonderful memoir too by Russian translator Tatyana Stupnikova, and she talks about when the Katyn evidence is produced and how shocked she is and what a dark day that is. So the translators, right, didn't know. And but yeah, it is a big question, who exactly got what piece of information at what point.
Well, and then we have a question from Timothy that relates to the secret protocol. So could you say more about how Soviet actors strategized their response to von Ribbentrop's testimony regarding their secret protocols? Did they ignore it? Did they deny it? Did they distinguish it? How did they handle it?
Yeah, so I want to go back a little bit on that one, because it's one of those really interesting things with the case. So before the trials even started, a couple of weeks before, first of all, I should say that at the outset, it is agreed as part of the London Charter, right, that the trials are only going to deal with European Axis crimes. So that's just a given, right? And that everyone is on the same page about. But a couple of weeks before the trials start, Jackson's been getting information from intelligence suggesting that British imperialism might be brought up during the trials, and that the Soviet invasion of Poland might be brought up during the trials, and that other issues might be brought up. And so there's a meeting that's held 2 weeks before, Pokrovsky's there and other representatives of the Soviet, of these different delegations, where he basically asks the members present, if there's anything that they all should know ahead of time, like in terms of things that their governments might have done during the war, just so that it's not a big surprise should things come up in the trials. And he says that, that he would need to consult with his government if there are contentious issues, and that just to sort of know so that they're not all taken by surprise. So the Soviets interpret this as him asking for a taboo list, like a list of topics that won't be broached in court. And at that point, they report on this back to Moscow, and Vyshinsky and the other members of the Vyshinsky Commission. And the Vyshinsky Commission, by the way, it includes representatives, very high up representatives of all of the branches of the Soviet security forces. So representatives of the NKVD and Smersh, which is all of these. So they know, right, what's going on. And so at that point, by the time that Vyshinsky, when he goes to Nuremberg, rather, from Moscow, he brings along with him a list that they've put together of these taboo topics that it would be good for them not to talk about. And included on that list it's the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, or I forget however they call it, and all of the details. So, all of the details, I mean, that's probably code for the secret protocols, right? And so in the secret meetings there with Rudenko and the others, Vyshinsky shares the contents of this list without the list itself, right? And he tells Rudenko that he should reach an agreement with the other prosecutors about the details of this list, but not to share an actual list. Anyway, so Rudenko thinks that these things are not going to come up in the trial. And so, but it starts coming up very early on. And because again, Ribbentrop brings it up, people even before Ribbentrop bring it up. Some of the German defense attorneys are constantly trying to introduce copies of the secret protocols. There's questions about whether the copies are authentic, and so they're not allowed in because of that. But once Ribbentrop presents it, it's kind of out there, right? And at that point, there's not really much that they can do about it. Some people speculate that that's why Zoria was either killed or committed suicide, because it's right in the wake of that. And it's out there. And not only is it out there, the Soviets have success in the sense that they managed to prevent an actual copy of the secret protocols being introduced as evidence, but the details are in the trial record. And a copy of the secret protocols are actually published in the Western press as well. So the secret protocols, by the end of the Nuremberg trials, they're not a secret at all. It's kind of, right, it's they're out there.
Protocols at that point.
Yeah, the protocols, they're out there, which again is so strange that, again, like the current Russian government goes through phases of not wanting to talk about it. I mean, it's been out there since 1945. So yeah. What are you going to do?
We had some conversation, obviously, and this is sort of related to the discussion about Katyn, but how did the Soviets react to the introduction of evidence of Admiral Nimitz and the US Navy engaging in tactics similar to that of the U-boats, thus serving, I believe it lessened the sentence of Admiral Donitz, if I'm remembering correctly, because I think my understanding is the Russians sort of went into this, that the defense arguments that the Allies did the same thing probably weren't going to be part of the trial. So did the Soviets have a particular reaction to this, given that they had assumed death penalty for everybody, that having some of these? And there's also a related question, and how did they react to the acquittal of Speer?
Okay, so yeah, in terms of so absolutely, I mean, they believe that they're arguing for that there's no no jiu-jitsu arguments, right, should be allowed. And the Nimitz one is one of the few ones that are allowed, actually, that does make it in for various reasons. But in terms of that's interesting. It's not one of the things that they focus on as much. They're much more focused on Ribbentrop and Goering and some of the other defendants than they are about the naval defendants, right? And so, but they do, it's interesting. They bring it up sometimes. They'll bring up those other issues, but more to show that they're on the same side as the British. That so it's more in that kind of a context. In terms of the Speer sentence, I mean, they're very unhappy about that. Yeah, for all the obvious reasons.
And then, so similarly, since this question is from Gregory, since some of the defendants were found guilty but not executed, are there any records of the Russians' dispute or, some of those conversations as to about those sentences? And did the Russians dissent in public at all? Was there anything, in the Western press or even in the Soviet Union press about their thoughts and feelings on the outcomes of the trial?
Yeah, so the dissent itself was read out, so that was part of the public record. And then, so one of the things I found in the archives were all kinds of discussions about in Soviet occupied territory about the organization of demonstrations protesting the acquittals and the lighter sentences. And so there were demonstrations that were held. And also in the archives, there were also all kinds of discussions about, they clipped articles that ran in the press around the world that agreeing that the sentences were too light. And so they kept a record of that too. So yes, they were very much following up on that. And some of the Soviet memoirs of the trials spend a lot of time talking about the acquittals as well. So they were publicly upset about that. What was the first part of the question was about the
hold on. I may have marked it as answered. Let me ask you another question and go back and find it. So we had a question from Maya as well, is how did the Soviet press cover the IMT?
Oh, it's so interesting. The press coverage was one of the really interesting things to look at. So every day, big articles. So they would, and almost transcript-like, but not of everything. So Pravda and Izvestia, which are the two big Soviet newspapers, every day on the front page, there, especially when the prosecution case was going on, there'd be huge articles about the trials and covering just the details. There would also be a bunch of Soviet political cartoonists, including Boris Efimov, would run lots of political cartoons in the press as well. And then there would be these sort of feature stories focusing on some of the defendants and on some of the evidence, right? But what's interesting to me is during the defense case, and not surprising, right? The coverage fell away. They didn't focus as much on the defense case because they didn't think that there was a need to present the defense testimony to the Soviet people. And so while the defense case was going, they would present little bits, but there would be these lines in Pravda, like Goering just gave the usual fascist propaganda. Right, that's what all it would say about his testimony. And while they would have a short article about Goering's testimony, there would be like a recap of Rudenko's presentation or a recap of some of the shocking evidence presented earlier on. But the idea was to really keep the focus on the prosecution's case and the charges against the defendants. They also, the coverage of the witness testimony was, I think, done very, very well, where they covered a lot of that verbatim too.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. So the first part of that question was, is there a record of the dispute around the death penalty or other sentences issue?
Oh yeah. So that's part of the, so there are, yes. So there are indeed some archival copies of some of the judges' deliberations. And some of those, the copies of the judges' deliberations have been talked about in some previous works about the Nuremberg trials. What we have from the Soviet archives in terms of the kind of correspondence that went back to Nikitchenko were this particular ways in which he was supposed to then object to certain sentences. So we know what the Soviets, how they would have wanted things to be, and even where they were willing to give in on. But yeah, that's yeah, I think it's in Syracuse University, the Biddle collection in the Syracuse University archives is where I saw some of the other materials on the judges' deliberations.
Interesting. Okay. We have a question from Eli Rosenbaum. Do the files in Moscow indicate that Stalin and his senior deputies considered the possibility that, hold on really quick, because I think I skipped the first part of the question. Okay. Are you surprised that Treinin was allowed to publish a book in the USSR during World War II, urging adoption of the concept of the crime of aggressive war or the crime against peace, much less that the Soviet delegation at London was permitted to push for its inclusion in the Nuremberg Charter?
So, oh, I love this. So Trianon, okay. So Trianon's book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, actually started off as a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Molotov and Wyszynski, they had wanted the Institute of Law to put together a case for what could you try the Nazi leaders for? Could you try leaders for launching an aggressive war? Can you try leaders for crimes against, they weren't calling it crimes against humanity at the time, but for atrocities and for war crimes of an aggressive war. And so Trianon is writing, he wrote this report, it was on spec, right, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was because they wanted to go forward and argue for trials. And I worked in one of the other archives I did research in was the Academy of Sciences archive in Moscow. So I got to see some of the early drafts of Trianon's report, and again, Wyszynski's comments on it. So to see how that evolved. So the fact that then Trianon published this book, Trianon didn't publish this book, right? Soviet leaders published this book. This was Wyszynski published this book, and Wyszynski wrote the introduction, and Molotov and Stalin signed off on it. So this was part of a big push, right, on the part of the Soviets to push for a trial, an international trial of Nazi leaders, and part of the big push for reparations. So that's how some of this starts. Now, I sense that where the question is coming from, and again, I think this is so interesting, is that of course the Soviets were also guilty of crimes against peace. And so like, why would they be publishing something about the guilt of crimes against peace? But they thought, again, that they didn't talk about the invasion of Poland as a crime against peace, right? They talked about that as just something they, again, it's I should go back to the specific language of before I say how they talked about it, but they didn't talk about it as a crime against peace. And they certainly didn't talk about the war against Finland as a crime against peace. They didn't talk about the invasion of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as crimes against peace. Right, it was just kind of peaceful annexations, right, in quotes here. And so, again, because the trials then are supposed to just be about European Axis crimes, they never think that this is going to come up, which, right, go figure.
Right. We have a question from one of the former war crimes prosecutors in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. What was the role of the Soviets in the selection of the accused?
So that's a great question too. So the Soviets, the Soviets do not have as many defendants in their custody. And so when the initial deliberations are happening about this trial, most of the big names, Goering, Ribbentrop, right, they're in American and British custody. So part of why the Soviets actually even want to be part of this four-power tribunal, like once they've been calling for a four-power tribunal, but at the end of the war, the big names are in American and British custody. And so the Soviets then they're pushing to have some of the people who they have in custody included. But there's also initially, this is another one of those tunnels we can go, find funny roads that we can go down, because there's tensions between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Soviet secret police with security forces, the NKVD. Most of the possible defendants that the Soviets could offer, those who are in prison in the Soviet Union, they're in the custody of the NKVD and Smersh. And the NKVD and Smersh don't want to give them up. They're reluctant to give them up for an international tribunal. And so initially, it takes a long time for the NKVD to actually release the list of possible names that could be included. And when they do, it's kind of last minute. So Nikitchenko is able to successfully negotiate for the conclusion of Rader and Fritzsche. So they get 2 in there. But the other thing to keep in mind is everybody thinks initially that this is just the first of a whole series of four-power trials. And so they're okay with this, that they get 2 included, because they think, okay, there are going to be more trials later, and then they'll be bringing more defendants at that point in time.
Got it. Well, and so we do have a couple of questions involved sort of on that follow-up, is that why is there evidence, or did you come across anything that explained why the Soviets, and if you came across anything about the British and French, not participants in those subsequent trials in Nuremberg, and, sort of in a lot of places they were conducting smaller local trials as well. So comment on that.
Yeah, the Americans and the French wanted there to be further foreign power trials, which I think is incredibly interesting given how much didn't go according to how the Soviets wanted things to go. But the Soviets and the French in particular wanted there to be foreign power trials of industrialists, right? Krupp was supposed to be tried at Nuremberg as one of the representatives of the industrialists. That fell apart. Again, they think there'll be more foreign power trials. And most of the industrialists, a lot of the big names again, are in American and British custody. It's the Americans and to some extent the British, but really the Americans. Jackson is so done with the Soviets at the end of Nuremberg, and so are the members of the American forces in Germany too, that they basically decide that they're not going to work with them anymore. And at that point too, the Soviets have already started taking reparations in the form of industrial equipment. The Soviets have overseen like fake elections in a lot of states. So a lot of things have happened also in terms of the Cold War that at that point, again, I think, again, the possibilities and the perils of international cooperation, I think at a certain point, it was decided that the perils of further cooperation and foreign power trials outweighed the possibilities of it. And so it's really the Americans' choice to go on and to do these subsequent trials on their own. But absolutely, everyone is holding their own war crimes trials afterwards. But Nuremberg ends up being the only foreign power one.
We have a question from Gregory, and I will be wrapping up our question shortly because while I appreciate your time, Francine, I don't want to keep you here all day. Among American lawyers, the Soviets' lack of experience with cross-examination and some of their clumsiness when their turn came is noted. Is there any record in the Soviet archives about how best to cross-examine some of the lead defendants? Goering or Ribbentrop or anyone else that you can think of?
So the Soviets, again, just when we think about like what they think things were going to look like, what we have are questionnaires, like lists of questions that they put together for the defendants with the anticipated answers. So they thought it was going to go the USS, the defendant will answer that, and so on. So that's what they had put together. They had worked this out. And so once they're actually in the midst of doing a cross-examination and things aren't going according to plan, then they're really not sure what to do. And they start at some point just like giving like these long speeches, and so it doesn't go very well. And at that point, they don't really manage to gain control over it. They just don't. And again, if you think about how they're so dependent on permission from Moscow for what to do and what to bring up and what to say, and that they don't have as much information as they should, right, about Nazi crimes, they're really at a loss. It was one of the things that really surprised me, I've got to say. When I was working on the book, I didn't think I was going to have so much about the defense case, but it was so interesting just to see like how things played out and how unprepared they were for it. So.
We have a question from Malcolm that I'll ask because you alluded to Telford Taylor's book earlier. And Malcolm just wants to know how, in light of the research you did and the new materials that you had access to, how does Telford Taylor's writing on the Russians in his book, The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials, hold up?
I love that book. It's such a great book. It's just so well written, and it's so again, you read it for perspective, right? From the perspective of Taylor, for what he at least later says he thought was happening. I think it's very, very interesting. There are some really fun things about reading these American sources and then doing the research. There's this crazy moment before the trial starts where the Soviets are trying to stall, and they come up with this whole thing of saying that Rudenko, who's back in Moscow, kind of being briefed, that Rudenko has malaria and that he can't return, and they're trying to have a delay. And like Taylor spends a bunch of time speculating on this in his memoirs, like what's going on, like do they really not have enough time, and so it was actually really amazing to be like, yeah, they actually really didn't have enough time. They really were like completely unprepared. They didn't have half of what they needed translated. Like they were still waiting for Stalin to sign off on some things, and they couldn't move forward without that. So again, like these moments where the Americans are wondering like what on earth is going on with the Soviets, to be able to answer that was really great. So I think that Taylor, based on what he knew, he really paints an incredible picture.
Okay. We have a question from Professor Barrett. Jackson suggested very obliquely that some of his Soviet Union colleagues wanted to defect, but couldn't because of their loved ones back home. Any thoughts on who those would-be defectors might have been?
Oh my God, I love that. I have no idea, but Nikitchenko gets in trouble afterwards for apparently having had some liaison with a German woman in, so one can only wonder and speculate and hope for like some movie version where this is all revealed. I don't know. That's a
Very
great,
scandalous, very scandalous.
yes.
All right. Final question. What was the fate of the Soviet judges and prosecution team after the trials?
Yeah, that's complicated. Different things happen to different ones of them. So again, Nikitchenko gets swept up in a big trial of judges. So he lives, but he's disgraced. Rudenko goes on to have quite the career as Soviet Procurator General and is involved in further repressions and trials of dissidents and things like that. So that's what happens to him. Trainin and other members of the Jewish intelligentsia get swept up in the anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign. Trainin, again, it's looking very, very bad for him. And then Stalin dies. And so Stalin dies, Trainin lives. But he's, again, his things are not the same afterwards. Yeah, and so kind of it really depends. Some of the members of the Soviet security police, they also get swept up in the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, and some of them are murdered. So different fates. Which again, is it did Stalin like how things go, or did he not like how things go? I mean, yeah, the fact that Rudenko does okay, but Nikitchenko doesn't, I don't know how much that really reveals. But yeah, I did try to trace their stories afterwards because yeah, I was interested in that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Francine, very much for being with us and spending so much time with us. We do have a few comments and a few questions that we didn't quite get to. And so if you're amenable, I will email those to you and we can
that'd be great.
update things later. So I want to thank our audience for joining us today for the Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II. And we hope that we have provided you some food for thought and a lot of new reading material. And the Al and Marge Brown Lecture on World War II was established in 2018. And thanks to generous donors to the Jackson Center. And it's part of what enables us to bring all of our free programming to the world. Quick couple of programming notes. Our Tea Time series this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern will be with Equality Now. In February, we are taking a look at women's equity issues under our theme, The Work Left to Do. And on the 17th, we will be celebrating a little belatedly Justice Jackson's birthday with the program Jackson Day in Warren. And it will be, we will be reading excerpts of a play called Nuremberg. And it actually lifts some of the direct trial transcripts. And so we have a group of amateur friends who will be reading I Believe I Am Playing Daring. So I'm working on being a lot more menacing than I currently am. We thank you all very much for joining us today and look forward to seeing you again soon. And Francine, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.